Chapter 18, Gone Missing. I think you can get to a point where nihilism, if that's the right word, is overwhelming, and the basic laws that society has set up, either religious or social laws, become meaningless. Things just get really dark. You lose those constraints, and then anything goes. The forces that set that in motion, I don't know exactly what they'd be. I think just a lot of frustration, lack of finding something that you can hold on to, lack of contact with people, That's one of the most dangerous things, I think, isolation. Nebraska was about that American isolation. What happens to people when they're alienated from their friends and their community and their government and their job? Because those are the things that keep you sane, that give meaning to life in some fashion. And if they slip away, and you start to exist in some void where the basic constraints of society are a joke, then life becomes kind of a joke, and anything can happen. Bruce Springsteen, speaking with Kurt Loder, 1984. As he was preparing Nebraska for release, Bruce Springsteen was also, oddly enough, finalizing the purchase of his first home. But it wasn't in Colts Neck, wasn't even in New Jersey, neither was it in Nebraska. It was a 4-bedroom place in the Hollywood Hills, a Los Angeles address with space enough for both a private life and soon enough a professional-grade recording setup. He bought it without ever setting foot in the place. Really, he bought the idea of a home. The house, at 7965 Fairholme Drive, was walking distance from Hollywood Boulevard, but still far enough up the hill to offer a stunning view of the city at night, jewels scattered across the desert. Given the estates in that general area, though, this residence didn't stop anyone in their tracks or find a place on the map of the stars' homes. It was modest. It did have a little Hollywood pedigree, however. 7965 Fairholme Drive was the former residence of Sidney Toler. Sidney Toler was old Hollywood. Born in Missouri, he'd appeared on Broadway, owned and run theater companies in Maine and Nova Scotia. But no surprise, his career wasn't made in Maine or Nova Scotia. He's best remembered for his role as the Asian-American detective Charlie Chan in the long-running film series of the same name. Toler wasn't the first person to go out to Hollywood to become someone he wasn't, and Bruce Springsteen wouldn't be the last. New house, new beginning, new man, or so the dream went. California was hardly an arbitrary choice for Springsteen's first experience of home ownership. His parents had moved west from New Jersey when he was a young musician, stumbling toward his first recording contract, and by the late 1970s, with several tours behind him, he knew Los Angeles well. Along with New York City, LA was the tour stop that mattered the most for national acts. It was also a steady contrast to the sometimes harsh weather back east. Palm trees, blue skies, sand, and ocean. Nature collaborated in creating perfect conditions for diminished introspection. It didn't take long for touring musicians to have favorite restaurants, know the way to the water, understand the city's traffic patterns, and finally talk about moving there. To wake up and see the sun day after day after day after day. When Springsteen made that call to Landau to see how Nebraska was faring, it was from the road, in the midst of a trip west to move into Charlie Chan's old place. He was on the journey with his friend Matt Delia, the same friend Springsteen mentioned years before in his King Biscuit Flower Hour interview. They tracked a route that took them not directly west, but first to a few places that mattered, Memphis and New Orleans, capital cities of American music. They drove in a 1969 Ford XL, an automobile celebrated among the vintage car crowd as Ford's largest performance car. Springsteen took it upon himself to make tapes that reflected the regions they were in. When Professor Longhair was playing over the car's speakers, you knew you were in New Orleans, getting close. Springsteen's was a studious approach to the great American road trip. It wasn't Springsteen's first road trip, but when he published his 2016 memoir, none of the others got anything close to the space reserved for that 1982 journey. After that one, things weren't going to be the same again for Bruce Springsteen. But the story wouldn't be told in full until he was the one to tell it. I made Nebraska, he explained to Dave Marsh for the author's 1987 biography, Glory Days. It came out, I got in the car, I drove across the country. I might have been recognized once someplace or something. And I was really happy with the record. I really felt that it was my best record to that date as far as an entire album goes. I felt that it was my best writing. I felt that I was getting better as a writer. I was learning things. I was certainly taking a hard look at everything around me. But the story would change dramatically over the years. Springsteen's conversation with Marsh revealed little of what would be shared decades later. Even Marsh, talking with Peter Ames Carlin more than 20 years after the publication of Glory Days, addressed the matter very differently. Bruce definitely had a major psychological crisis right about that time. I could have been clearer in the book, but wasn't because I wasn't comfortable with it at the time. But I felt comfortable with his depths to say the guy in Nebraska isn't Charlie Starkweather. It's him. Only with the publication of his memoir, Born to Run, would Springsteen give his audience the more unsettling, unfiltered version of the trip west with Delia. It is, in fact, the memoir's centerpiece. And while Springsteen has long had a reputation as a public figure who allows his audience a view of his private self, the story of the road trip, as Springsteen tells it, is the man at his most unguarded. In Springsteen's recollection, he and Delia had driven through the South and were coming into the vast Midwestern and Western landscapes of prairie and plain when a rupture took place within him. By that time in the trip, the end of the journey, its inevitability, had begun to breathe on Springsteen. Eventually, the Ford XL was going to be approaching an ocean. Then it would be a matter of turning left, turning right, turning back, or, as planned, stopping. His arrival at a new home, a new beginning in the Hollywood Hills, was becoming an anxious matter. Memphis and New Orleans had been distractions, and the comfort of that first leg was gone. When the two travelers entered a small western town, coming upon a local fair where townsfolk mixed with one another and music played, something inside Springsteen was triggered. He describes it in Born to Run. From nowhere, a despair overcomes me. I feel an envy of these men and women in their late summer ritual, the small pleasures that bind them in this town together. Right now, all I can think of is that I want to be amongst them, of them, and I know I can't. I can only watch. That's what I do. I watch, and I record. I do not engage, and if and when I do, my terms are so stringent, they suck the lifeblood and possibility out of any good thing and real thing I might have. It's here, in this little river town, that my life is an observer, an actor staying cautiously and safely out of the emotional fray, away from the consequences. The normal messiness of living and loving reveals its cost to me. At 32, in the middle of the USA on this night, I've just exceeded the once surefire soul and mind-numbing power of my rock and roll meds. I feel a deeper anxiety than I've ever known. Why here? Why tonight? 34 years later, I still don't know why. All I do know, he goes on to write, is as we age, the weight of our unsorted baggage becomes heavier, much heavier. But that wasn't all he knew. By the end of that passage, he moves in on the formidable truth. Long ago, the defenses I built to withstand the stress of my childhood, to save what I had of myself, outlived their usefulness. Now the bill collector is knocking, and his payment will be in tears. Springsteen was clear, adamant, when he told me that Nebraska is about his childhood, about mining those early experiences, going back there to confront his past. The Nebraska songs are intimately connected with the unsorted baggage he describes as getting heavier, much heavier, upon entering his 30s. And if in the past his rock and roll meds, administered nightly when he took the stage and got a much-needed sense of connection, camaraderie, and sheer motion, allowed him to navigate adult life despite that baggage. In the months after Nebraska's release, he didn't have 100 tour stops to dull the pain. He was moving into a new home, the first he'd ever purchased, alone, preparing to start a new life, with far fewer resources than he'd ever had to work with. By the time Dave Marsh spoke to the New Yorker's David Remnick in 2012, after the Peter Ames Carlin interview referenced earlier, he discussed Springsteen's mental health after the release of Nebraska with even less equivocation. Bruce was feeling suicidal. The depression wasn't shocking per se. He was on a rocket ride from nothing to something, and now you were getting your ass kissed day and night. You might start to have some inner conflicts about your real self-worth. Less equivocation, yes, but not yet anything in the way of satisfying explanation. Ass-kissing and rocket rides don't explain thoughts of suicide. Despair is the word Springsteen uses in his memoir. When he got to Los Angeles, walking in the door of his new home, he wanted to leave immediately, to just start driving again. But to where? Every road trip, every tour was going to end, and the endings were getting harder. It was Mr. Landau whom Springsteen called, to tell him that something was not right at all. The last call to John Landau had been to check on Nebraska's chart position, but this was another kind of communication altogether. Landau had come to know when it was a manager that was needed and when it was a friend. And Landau said simply but directly, "You need professional help." That statement wasn't casual, and it had been waiting for its moment. It was Landau who, describing to me his first listens to the Nebraska demos, said they concerned him on a friendship level. It wasn't the first time the two men had talked about Springsteen's depression, but it was the first time they spoke of it as a crisis to be addressed immediately. The Nebraska experience was clinging to Springsteen like some kind of psychic residue. It got in the car with him as he headed for Los Angeles and met him at the door when he arrived. His account in Born to Run captures the state he found himself in upon arrival in L.A. I've broached these subjects in several long, semi-analytical conversations with John in the past. He gets the drift. It's dark and getting darker. My well of emotion is no longer being channeled and safely pipelined to the surface. There's been an event, and my depression is spewing like an oil spill all over the beautiful turquoise-green gulf of my carefully planned and controlled existence. Its black sludge is threatening to smother every last living part of me. At my request, he makes a call. I get a number, and 2 days later, I drive 15 minutes west to a residential home office in a suburb of Los Angeles. I walk in, look into the eyes of a kindly, white-haired, mustached, complete stranger, sit down, and burst into tears. That's where Springsteen was when his fellow songwriters were admiring his latest recording. There was Nebraska, Springsteen told me as we sat together in Colts Neck, and then there was this breakdown. So yeah, it makes sense that you connect the two. Warren Zanes, when you write a song, you inhabit the world of that song. With Nebraska, you'd just gone into a collection of songs that took you into your childhood. You were spending a lot of time in the trouble back there. Then things come apart. Springsteen, I don't know. That's a puzzle to me. You would just look at it on the surface and say, yeah, there was Nebraska, and then there was this. What happened to me on that road trip? That makes sense. And that's why Born in the USA wasn't completed for another year or two. Once I'd gotten over the curve of where I was emotionally, I had to get to the other side of that to finish that other record. So you would look and say, very strange. I finished Nebraska. I took a big road trip. The road trip was just, well, an epiphany of its own, which I never really came back from. So it's a pivotal album, yes. How much your music has to do with your emotional life, I would say that I'm uncertain about that. I've written so many kinds of songs in so many different emotional spaces. I'm not sure how they connect, or even if they do connect. I'm a little hesitant to make that immediate connection. Warren Zanes, to make it causal. Springsteen, I'm just not sure that that's the way creativity works and functions. But you did have to put yourself in that isolated place to make that record. My hometown is 10 minutes to the west. I did and still do a lot of living there. I go back and plumb those mysteries to this day. Warren Zanes, in Nebraska, as you describe it, was a return specifically to childhood trauma. That's a triggering place for anyone who might have that in their past. With those songs, you went there and stayed for some time. You moved back in. Springsteen, yeah, I would say that that's true. And obviously that's what's going to happen if you're going to go into that past the way I did. You know, I think it was the first time, pre-analysis, of a deeply investigated period of my life where I started to question what's the matter with me. Something's wrong. Something's not right. I'm having a really hard time placing myself in this world. That was the first thing that came out. That record was the first thing that came out when I started to go back and question my own sense of place, who I was, what I was doing, where I came from. That was the music that came out. And then the road trip. In order to write about other people's isolation, Springsteen had gone all the way into his own. And then, having created the document of his isolation in the form of an album called Nebraska, for the first time he was cut off from the audience that had always been there to provide the energy and life he fed on. The critic and writer Robert Palmer remarked of Nebraska, "It's been a long time since a mainstream rock star made an album that asks such tough questions and refuses to settle for easy answers, let alone an album suggesting that perhaps there are no answers." Chapter 19. Follow that dream, wherever that dream may lead. May, born Axton. You know, what I can't understand is how you keep that leg shaking just at the right tempo all the time you're singing. Elvis. Well, it gets hard sometimes. I have to stop and rest it, but it just automatically wiggles like that. From a 1955 interview reprinted in Peter Grolnick's Last Train to Memphis. The time between John Landau's urging that Springsteen get professional help and the release of Born in the USA is something of a blur, if not close to a blank, in the existing accounts of Springsteen's life, even in his own memoir. It's a period in which the documentation gets thinner, the witnesses fewer. Springsteen was in Los Angeles for the winter after his drive west, and then returned to New Jersey, not getting a lot of songwriting done in either case. He was spotted at a Prince concert, already showing the effects of a new weight training routine. He was known to have returned home for Stephen Van Zant's New Year's Eve 1982 wedding, at which he joined various E Street Band members, Southside Johnny, Gary U.S. Bonds, and others for songs including Save the Last Dance for Me, Joel Blond, and Shout. Little Richard conducted the Van Zant ceremony. Percy Sledge performed When a Man Loves a Woman as the couple came down the aisle, and Springsteen showed up without a date. But mostly, it was just sightings in that period. Hollywood's Club Lingerie, joining Jimmy and the Mustangs for Twist and Shout, a brief on-stage appearance with Clarence Clemens and the Red Bank Rockers at the Keystone in Palo Alto. Earlier in the year, when he was still in the Colts Neck rental and Nebraska was recorded but not completed, Springsteen would often drop by the Stone Pony in Asbury Park and join the house band. But that was a just down the road, jump on stage thing in the old neighborhood. Los Angeles was another matter. After the road trip west, Springsteen wasn't thinking about playing Midnight Hour for surprise clubgoers. Mostly he was at home, trying to make it into a place he belonged, or himself into a person who belonged there. When John Landau flew out to Los Angeles the winter after Springsteen's arrival at 7965 Fairholme Drive, no one was entirely sure what was going on, Landau included. Chuck Plotkin was just one person who worried that maybe something had soured in his relationship with Springsteen. He just didn't know what. Their communication was down to a trickle. Looking back on the situation, Plotkin suggests that Landau might have been the only one with the necessary sensitivity to understand what Springsteen was wrestling with, or at least the only one in the inner circle who could make room for Springsteen to do whatever wrestling he needed and in his own time. John is the one utterly permanent and irreplaceable constant, Plotkin insists, in Bruce's career but also in his life. John has, over and over again, figured out how to provide the buoyancy that Bruce needs from his closest ally across these strange changes. I mean, when I talk to John about them, they don't even seem strange to him. When it came to finally deciding to release his Rough Home demos as Nebraska, it was Springsteen alone who made the decision. But Landau was the collaborator who gave him space to do so, the one who wasn't threatened when some room had to open up between them. The people around you can only take you so far, said Landau. In that instance, he'd been taken as far as we could take him. Managing Springsteen, as Landau had come to practice it, was an art of intuition, of knowing when to step back as much as when to step in. With Springsteen in Los Angeles in the wake of that breakdown, Landau was going to push his artist into making Nebraska's follow-up, no matter that Landau felt they were sitting on the makings of a remarkable album. Born in the USA, Glory Days, My Hometown, Cover Me, and the other recordings were still on the shelf. I had my own ambitions as producer and manager, Landau told me. I wanted this thing to succeed. I had tremendous pride in what we had done, and I knew this was the moment. I had my own sense for what he had to do in this moment. He was a person with incredible influence at that time. Landau could feel an alignment, the possibility of a crowning experience that was a result of years of momentum. He was only lacking one key element, Bruce Springsteen. He was so introspective, Landau said. I'm not talking about the psychotherapy. He was introspective long before the psychotherapy. I'm talking about since I'd known him. Everything for him was a matter of identity. His fears about if he became so big, would it invalidate or contradict his identity as an artist? Would he become a pop star and have people lose the focus on his deepest talent? I just had confidence that this moment was meant to be, that it's part of the story, and Nebraska was part of that story too. But Landau wasn't saying any of that to Springsteen just then. Landau was listening. There were certainly a few people around Springsteen eager to supply ideas of what they felt should happen next, but Springsteen wasn't facing a shortage of ideas. That would never be his dilemma, not then and not now. His well-documented deliberation and second-guessing, which informed the making of several of his best-known albums, Born to Run and Darkness on the Edge of Town among them, were part of a creative process, not some sign that he'd run out of ideas. If anything, abundance was the problem when there was one, having to choose from all that was there. Landau had discovered early that managing Springsteen had far more to do with timing than generating ideas. He learned to trust that Springsteen was on a path, even if that path was, in some sections, unmarked. In fact, Landau often protected Springsteen's right to get lost. Landau wasn't yet Springsteen's manager when he first recognized that the rhythms of the creative work were most commonly the thing he could help with, stopping and starting. With Springsteen in the middle of Born to Run and in too deep to see where he was in relation to the whole, Landau told him that Born to Run was, in Landau's view, a finished recording. It could be over, Landau suggested, but it would have to be Springsteen's choice to end it. He saw an artist at risk of trying to make a recording that said everything that could ever be said. There's a point, Landau told his friend and co-producer, when you're working on an album so long that you're in danger of going into its follow-up. Just then, Springsteen was ready to hear those words, and he let the process stop. Heading to meet Springsteen at his new Los Angeles home in 1983, Landau had some sense that with Born in the USA, the timing was going to be about when to encourage Springsteen to see that, as Landau put it, this was the moment. But when he got to Springsteen's house, Landau knew his own timing was off. Bruce played me some things, great stuff of course, he recalled to me, but I saw that we were back to the drawing board. How, Chuck Plotkin asked, considering Landau's style, is it possible to be as supportive as you need to be and still be an honest critic of the work? Striking that balance likely sounds easier than it is. John is not a yes man, but he has a great capacity to know when to be what for Bruce. Listening to Springsteen's new recordings at the Fairholme Drive house, neither Landau nor Springsteen knew exactly where they stood. The plan, Dave Marsh writes in Glory Days, was for Bruce to come to California and spend several weeks mixing the rock and roll material with Plotkin. At the same time, Bruce arranged for Toby Scott to install a more elaborate 24-track home studio in an outbuilding at his Los Angeles home. But it wasn't quite that easy to change gears from the gloomy and insulated world in Nebraska to the more open and friendly space of Born in the USA. He had a little two-car garage, and over it was an apartment, recalled Toby Scott. I said, yeah, I'll get you set up. I put together a little recording studio made up of a Trident Trimix console of, I believe, 12 channels, maybe 16, and an 8-track MCI tape machine, 1-inch tape. I added the cheap Orb and Spring reverb. I was never into spending a lot of money. Then I taught Mike Batlin how to record. Mike took notes. He recorded about a half a dozen songs on 8-track. What Springsteen wasn't doing, though, was mixing the rock and roll material. With the Fairholme Drive studio installed and Batlin acting as engineer, Springsteen would, in stops and starts, work on some music. County Fair comes from that period, and in the wake of Springsteen's memoir, it's hard not to see the song in the light of the depression that descended on him toward the end of that road trip. In that small town in the West, he came upon a local scene that seemed to him bucolic and out of his reach. County Fair captures the world he couldn't be a part of, an idealized picture of community, connection, small-town peace. It's the antithesis of Nebraska's hopelessness. He wanted crickets on that one. There were crickets up there on the side of the hill. I said, go up there with the mic, use one of the condenser mics, and put it out there and crank the volume way up. You'll get the sound of crickets. So he did that. Bruce knew we had the equipment. It was different from using a TAC 4-track for sure. He mixed to a Sony F1, a kind of digital prototype. He used VHS or beta. It was far from what we dealt with for Nebraska. What wasn't different was the man alone, without a band behind him. But the sound and the feel and the sentiment of the Fairholme Drive recordings were already a departure from the Nebraska recordings, if an uncertain departure. There was a lack of cohesion to the songs that emerged in that time. They pulled in different directions. County Fair is a mid-tempo song played to a drum machine with the synthesizer pads sweetening the track. It leans toward what would be coming with Tunnel of Love. Springsteen's voice certainly doesn't need to fight its way through the thicket of a rock and roll combo. Richfield Whistle, another from that time, is one that could almost have fit on Nebraska, were it not for the story resolving with a kind of moral closure. A man has a choice to step back from violence and crime, to return to his wife and the love that's possible there, despite the unforgiving working life in which he's caught, and he chooses home. In a similar way, The Klansman has a strong sense of right and wrong in its story. There's no room to identify with the man selling white supremacy. Springsteen didn't do for The Klansman what he did for Charles Starkweather. The songs that were coming didn't connect one to the next in the way of the Colt's Neck material. But it would be a mistake to make too much of that. The search for direction is often how records are found. Though the mostly empty rooms of Springsteen's house were slowly getting furnished, the place remained foreign to him, a hotel without a front desk. By installing a home studio as quickly as he had, Springsteen decorated his life with transitions, personally, musically, psychologically. The messy in-betweens are often what's hidden from view as a recording artist's life and work are organized in bins, release by release. The struggle to create, the waiting, the stops and starts of songwriting, the setting off in one direction, only to have to backtrack, the unkind words spoken under pressure, the empty hours waiting on a song, all are mostly obscured. Those record bins are finally a distorted lens through which to consider a human's trajectory. Monotony and grocery shopping are among the hidden secrets of the record maker's life. Two recordings in particular shed light on Springsteen's whereabouts as he made his way from Nebraska to Born in the USA. Johnny Bye Bye, which had been recorded once before in the Nebraska sessions, and Follow That Dream. These are the hinge songs he needed to spend time inside so that he could find his way forward. The first was a dramatic reworking of Chuck Berry's Bye Bye Johnny, credited to Springsteen/Berry. The second, a cover of an Elvis Presley cut. Normally, when Springsteen did other people's material, it was in the context of the live shows, not studio recordings. It was an odd but telling situation. Springsteen was concealing himself behind other people's writing. So many years later, when he sat down with me, Springsteen contrasted the profound visibility of Born in the USA with the shadows in which he worked on Nebraska, talking about how the one made the other possible. Because of Nebraska, he told me, I could go as far in the other direction as I wanted to go, which I did, and that'd be fine. It would be fine. Nebraska gave me a lot of freedom. It gave me a lot of creative freedom. I don't know if there would have been a Born in the USA in the form it was in without Nebraska being released in front of it. So those two records do have a symbiotic relationship. They occurred at the same time. Those records were recorded simultaneously. enough to where I thought they were one record at one moment. That's how connected they are. While connected, bound to each other, the albums were like two sides of the man, the extremes of Springsteen's career and character. He'd been almost missing, and then he would come out of hiding into a kind of light brighter than anything he'd experienced in his career. The near anonymity of Nebraska and the almost heroic presence of Born in the USA reminded me, I told him, of another odyssey, borrowing his word for the self-investigation that was beginning in the Fairholme Drive period. He allowed me to see this one through. Warren Zanes. In Homer's Odyssey, the hero recovers his place as a husband and father, finds his home, but only by re-entering that home after 20 years away, disguised as a beggar, anonymous, stripped of his former glories. Springsteen. Go on. Warren Zanes. After war, misadventure, temptation, struggle of ego and lust, various trials, Odysseus returns to Ithaca, his true home, but the place is filled with suitors, men who want his wife's hand in control of his household. He can't simply announce himself. He's far outnumbered and would be slaughtered. So he returns disguised as a beggar, meaning Odysseus can only recover his position by first being nobody. Nobody, which he failed to do at the outset of his journey in a fit of hubris after escaping the Cyclops. So Odysseus learns from that earlier display of hubris and allows the suitors to treat him as nothing, a beggar in his own home, as an almost invisible man. But his power comes from exactly this, the relinquishing. From that position, he kills off the suitors who have taken his home. The point being that the only way to restore his place as man and hero was to first be nobody. Springsteen. Incredible. Warren Zanes. I can't help but look at Nebraska leading into Born in the USA as part of an artistic trajectory that somehow aligns with this. Nebraska sets it all aside, all the glory and achievement, the studio gloss, the big sounds, the band, the picture of a hero on the front cover, the interviews in which you tell the tales of your travels. It's all set aside. The recordings are loose, muddy at times, unfinished. And then you return with Born in the USA with all the heroic trappings. But like Odysseus, to get to the one, the heroic, you first have to give all that up. That's Nebraska. For me, the entire scope of your career, everything, fits between those two projects. Springsteen. It does. To this day, my perimeters were set in that moment. Warren Zanes. In your book, you actually use the word odyssey, saying that between those two recordings was the beginning of your personal odyssey. Springsteen. I know that with Nebraska, I was interested in making myself as invisible as possible. I just wanted to be another ghost on that particular record. It spoke to some need in me, some roaring need that might have been a result of having had the kind of success that I had. But I needed to know that I could go back and be nobody if I really needed to. It was an interesting moment. And yes, then Born in the USA became possible. John Landau has his own way of talking about what the albums meant in relation to each other. The Nebraska album, and this is not why it exists, that's not the point, but the Nebraska album, he told me, made the Born in the USA album possible. He continued, one of the things that figures into that sequencing idea is that Bruce, and forgive me for playing the psychiatrist here, but Bruce had a dream that was about big success. He obviously wanted it because I have a theory about this, that nobody becomes a big success unless they want to become a big success. It just doesn't happen by accident for anybody. And if it does, it doesn't last for 50 years. You can accidentally have a big hit. You can't accidentally have a superstar career. Bruce knew inside that he had the potential to be just about as big as he wanted to be. And he also had another side which really questioned the value of that and whether or not that was even something that was morally correct or whether or not any thinking guy could compromise his own inner integrity to go after that. I think Nebraska was liberating because he was so proud of that record. He'd made as uncommercial a statement as it was possible to make relative to who he was. It was so clear as a turn away from what he'd established, even by the early 80s. The albums were going to be two ways of answering the same question, a question that Springsteen had turned over in his mind many times. Should I really go after the big success? He answered no with Nebraska, and then he answered yes with Born in the USA. Both answers were correct. But there he was, in Los Angeles, in between those two responses to a question upon which, it seems, a significant part of his identity hinged. And that's where and why Johnny Bye Bye and Follow That Dream mattered just a little more than the other songs he was recording in that same period. Johnny Bye Bye and Follow That Dream were songs that allowed Springsteen to linger on the idea of Elvis Presley as myth, symbol, and man. Presley had given Springsteen the desire to be a performer and a model for what it looked like. But Presley's success came so fast and took on such unprecedented proportions that Presley never had a chance to ask himself the question, should I really go after the big success? When Springsteen played Follow That Dream and Johnny Bye Bye on the River Tour in 1980-81, he would sometimes speak of Elvis to his audience. I remember, Springsteen said one night, when a friend of mine called to tell me that Presley had died. It was so hard to understand how somebody whose music came in and took away so many people's loneliness and gave so many people a reason and a sense of the possibilities of living could have, in the end, died so tragically. It was a moving setup that, on that night, led into Springsteen's much altered version of Follow That Dream. Elvis's original Follow That Dream was recorded for the 1962 film of the same name. It wasn't an obvious Elvis cover, nothing rock and rollers went out of their way to find. It wasn't the Sun Records Elvis of That's All Right or anything like the Hound Dog he cut for RCA. With lines like, when your heart gets weary, time to sing a song, it was closer to the territory of Golden Age musicals than early rock and roll. But Springsteen dropped the tempo and rewrote what lyrics he needed to, including the above-mentioned line. There was a longing in Springsteen's version unknown to Presley's original. If you were in that audience when Springsteen spoke of Elvis, and all you ever knew of the king of rock and roll were the cartoonish imitators in the superstar's tabloid fodder final days, Springsteen's sense of loss and sorrow might have seemed misallocated. But Springsteen had a perspective on Elvis common enough among those who experienced Presley's emergence when the legend was not yet a legend. Everyone has their Genesis moment. Springsteen would later say, in a South by Southwest keynote, mine was 1956. Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show. It was the evening I realized a white man can make magic, that you did not have to be constrained by your upbringing, by the way you looked, or by the social context that oppressed you. You could call upon your own powers of imagination. You could create a transformative self, a certain type of transformative self that perhaps at any other moment in American history might have seemed difficult, if not impossible. Springsteen got a direct message that night in 1956. The transformative self as an idea meant that you could get the hell out of there, wherever your there was, psychological, physical, or both. By sheer intuition, Springsteen, still a child at the time, knew this mattered. He wouldn't need to be constrained by the living room in which he found himself, there under a portrait of his deceased aunt. At the time of those first Ed Sullivan Show appearances, that kind of empowering message wasn't handed to young people with any kind of regularity. The anxious talk around juvenile delinquency was focused on harnessing transformations among young people, on keeping them from becoming creatures that couldn't be controlled. Elvis was a vision of liberation, even triumph, there for the minds, hearts, and imaginations of young Americans. Springsteen heard the call at a very young age. Yes, it would be hard for later generations, meaning those who first saw Elvis as a thing of decline and decay, to fully grasp what happened for Springsteen and others who discovered Elvis in the mid-1950s. On some level, you had to be there then, and better still if you needed the message. The relentless packaging of Elvis, his records, movies, a body and face made into a commodity, which began almost immediately after his first commercial success, would make it difficult and eventually impossible to look back and see Elvis as had his early audiences. Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols would respond to Presley's death saying, "Fucking good riddance to bad rubbish." Where, Springsteen wondered aloud on the River Tour, did all the promise of Elvis circa 1956 go? By his death, Presley's transformative self had become not a symbol of possibility, but a cautionary tale, a transformation that found a man lost to himself. What had gone wrong and when? Elvis, or Johnny Cash, or Bo Diddley, or Carl Perkins, or James Brown, they were people who understood what it was like to be very poor. And because of their success, they looked back on childhood poverty from a high and distant place. Yet somehow you knew what they came from, no matter the gold and the glitter coming off the stage. They were all in their different ways, transformative selves. You could look through the 1954 yearbook of any New England prep school or Ivy League university and not run into a single Elvis Presley. At the time of his emergence, Elvis wasn't the name or the face or the look or the style of privilege. He signified, in a clear and consistent manner, working class identity. He was a shit kicker, and you could tell just by looking at him. Elvis's famous gold lame suit, made by nudies of Hollywood, didn't mask the truck driver. It elevated the truck driver. He rose spectacularly, but his end would suggest that what might start as an American dream can become a deal gone very wrong. Springsteen's ambivalence about his own success was in many ways borne out by Presley's example. But to move ahead in his own career, he needed to believe it could be otherwise. Presley's end need not be his own. Johnny Bye Bye concludes with the clearest statement of his feelings regarding a hero's final days. You didn't have to die. You didn't have to die. Rock and roll had sent some very poor kids into magnificent worlds, as Springsteen knew well, but no amount of Cadillacs could remove poverty's mark. Springsteen, it seems, would struggle to do as his hero hadn't, and would stay close to his roots. His obsessive trips to Freehold, driving past the dilapidated homes he knew as a boy, were the practice that came of that theory. He knew that Gracelands were places of deception. But Springsteen also knew he was going to go after the big success. He understood both things. It was a matter of readying himself, of doing it differently. First, it would be Nebraska, invisibility. Then the time he spent in those songs, Johnny Bye Bye and Follow That Dream, like meditations, preparing him for what was coming next. He was lifting weights, searching, singing to Elvis, unconsciously preparing for something he surely felt coming. My father didn't really survive, except in the most basic ways, Springsteen said, sitting across from me. So I was really the first one to sort of escape that hole. My sister did in her own way. With the life of my parents, though, Jesus. Yeah, my life is another life. More success was only going to take him further away from where he came from. But out there in Los Angeles, he was making the ropes that would keep him tied down to the earth. Springsteen. To me, Born in the USA was just what I had. That's all. It was just what I had available for songs. That was what I put on that record. I went through everything, took a long, long time. I waited a year just to get Bobby Jean. Dancing in the Dark, John forced me into. It's so funny. I put together the best pieces I had, and we put the record out. Warren Zanes. On the receiving end, it felt like a statement, and I listened to it that way. Springsteen. Funny. So did a lot of other people, I guess. But for me, that was my experience. I just put together what seemed like the best stuff I had. John Landau walked in the door at Fairholme Drive to find a Bruce Springsteen who was in the in-betweens. In between his New Jersey rentals and the first home he'd ever purchased. In between his life in a band and a solo adventure. In between his last romantic relationship and whatever was coming next. In between Nebraska and a record that remained unknown even if it was sitting right there. In between his present and a past that had been reawakened. When that first little bit of music started to come, it would have to make its way through all that in-betweenness. The drawing board is what Landau called the place. None of the music Springsteen wrote and recorded in that time was going to appear on his next album. It would just take a bit of time to understand that. John Landau wasn't telling Springsteen to return his attention to the tracks that had been recorded at the power station. He wasn't talking about hits, asking for Dancing in the Dark. He wasn't even asking Springsteen to please not make Nebraska 2. He was just going to see his friend to get a sense for where he was at. They talked about Elvis, books, some movies, art, where they'd have lunch. In time, Landau would help build a delicate bridge back to the idea of a big album. But not then. The big album would be so big that it would obscure the many months of uncertainty that followed the earlier Nebraska. The sheer power with which Born in the USA came into the world, more a detonation than a release, was like nothing Springsteen or his fans had ever seen. Everything he created earlier in his career and everything that came after would be organized in relation to Born in the USA. It didn't matter what Springsteen told the world. People were going to see Born in the USA as the result of great intention and strategy, as if he'd had it in his mind for years. The artist ambivalent about his singles was not going to have much of a vote with Born in the USA. The album itself would take over. The CBS executive Al Teller, the man who had seen Nebraska as a work of poetry that needed delicate, appropriate promotion in the workplace, would have a different thing to contend with when he was handed the follow-up. Next, we gave him Born in the USA, John Landau recalled, which is his bread and butter. Top 40, 7 top 10 singles. He was just the fucking energy he had. In some cases, you could have it both ways. An album air release that also had a few singles to keep the momentum. But what Teller got was the biggest album-to-album contrast in Springsteen's career. As one insider put it, Born in the USA, that was when the E Street Band members started buying houses. I didn't mind having the hit when we had it, Springsteen said when I asked him about the earlier Hungry Heart. I'm always a little suspicious of that stuff, and it wasn't what I was fundamentally interested in, but I didn't mind. It's just that I was an album artist. We remain so to this day. The only time we had any hits was when the album we were doing was such a hit that the songs became hits. Born in the USA, that's our greatest hits record. Just put that on and play it through. But the rest of the time, we didn't have singles. We had very few popular singles. It led people to imagine that Born in the USA had some kind of master plan behind it, a battle strategy, but it didn't. It had Nebraska behind it. That's where Born in the USA got its strength. John Landau's most conspicuous entrance into the process of making Born in the USA came when he pushed Springsteen to write the song that would become Born in the USA's first single, Dancing in the Dark. That was the final piece in the Born in the USA collection, and Springsteen was going to let it happen. The absolute refusal to make Nebraska conform to anything even close to the dominant rock aesthetic of 1982 loosened Springsteen up enough to give Landau, finally, a stronger position. Nebraska, what Springsteen referred to as the best collection of songs I'd written, was a place Springsteen could go when he needed to remember where he came from. Chapter 20, on repeat. Jimmy Iovine, a man who would experience remarkable success as an engineer and producer, who would start Interscope Records and finally launch Beats with Dr. Dre, started with a broom in his hands just to get inside the door of a recording studio. Custodial work was to the recording studio what the mailroom was to the talent agency. It was the unofficial point of entry into the world of commercial music. Iovine was never the type to sit back and wait for good fortune to come his way, so he took the broom and started sweeping. There's a balance to be struck between dreaming and doing. Once he'd established the dreaming, the easy part, Jimmy worked the doing like a man who knew exactly what he hoped to leave behind. It worked. Iovine got himself into the studio with John Lennon. Then he got himself into the studio with Bruce Springsteen in the E Street Band. There was some meatloaf in there too. In the case of working with Springsteen, he did it not from above, but from below. He wasn't even an engineer when he got on the project. He traded the broom for work as a second engineer, the one who typically handles the coffee machine and the tidying up as much as anything else. The second engineer is the guy coiling cables and cleaning up after the drummer. It's the exceptional second engineers or the driven second engineers who move over one seat to become engineers proper, and then they might have a voice in the conversation. What does it take to make that advance? Sometimes it's a willingness to start work at 3 a.m. without much warning. Sometimes it's just a matter of being there when the other guy leaves the room to check on the golf clubs he ordered. Jimmy took anything he could get, and in the end got near everything. No one is entirely clear when he went from being second engineer to an engineer. That story's a little fuzzy. In the winter of 2008, I was at the dinner table, a marginal figure at best, when Bruce Springsteen and Steven Van Zandt broke bread with a few others at Jimmy's house in Beverly Hills. Those present included Jimmy's wife at the time, Vicky, and a gentleman then running Paramount Studios. Will.i.am from the Black Eyed Peas came for dessert. The reason for this gathering? Interscope, the enormously successful record label Jimmy started after an enormously successful career producing records, was releasing the soundtrack to Martin Scorsese's Rolling Stones documentary, Shine a Light. The E Street Band was in town on the Magic Tour and had a night off. After dinner, in the Ivings home theater, there would be a screening of the Scorsese film. But really, at the heart of the evening was old friends having dinner. It was, I think, the first time Bruce and Steven together had visited Jimmy's Beverly Hills place. Only a handful of rock stars will ever have a home like Jimmy Iovine's. The Elton Johns of the world, they have them. The real money, some would argue, is with those who sell the stuff, not those who make it. The dealers, not the growers. Jimmy got some of that selling action before streaming made the marketplace a more complicated affair. But by that time, he'd already moved to headphones. In the new century, you'd have to be a pretty big artist to do a whole lot more than rent Jimmy's pool house. But in the same way that family members regress in one another's presence, no matter the passing of decades or the successes they might have experienced, so it is with people who shared intimate work situations, such as that of making records. That night in Beverly Hills, the guys who were around for the making of Darkness on the Edge of Town reverted to who they were back then. Jimmy might have secured those 10 acres in the Los Angeles area, but in some ways, he was still the engineer who had started as a second engineer. The constellations formed between people early often change a little over time, but it was Jimmy's house in Beverly Hills where the dinner took place. I don't think that was lost on anyone. Because of the Scorsese film, the talk at the table turned to the Rolling Stones. That's when Bruce and Steven took the conversation and went someplace with it. Here were two guys who had known each other longer than anyone else at the dinner. When it came to talking about the Rolling Stones, they were as much two young men in bands with strong opinions about rock and roll as they were rock and roll legends themselves. And those strong opinions were not about the greatness of the Rolling Stones, that was a given, but about what period, what record, what contributions mattered the most and why. This was a couple of biblical scholars who were also believers hashing it out. It wasn't about converting anyone. For the most part, everyone else at the table just listened. It was probably the best show in town that night. What stuck with me was something Springsteen said about Mick Jagger as a lyricist. It rubbed against the "it's only rock and roll" idea, upon which the Stones had built their legend. Springsteen, taking care to say this as if considering its full consequences, argued that Jagger's writing can be appreciated, understood in the way we appreciate and understand Bob Dylan's, at that level. My first thought, surprised by the argument, was, did the new Dylan really just say that about the other Dylan? But I'd already missed the first turn in the road. He obviously hadn't said anything about Dylan. He'd only mobilized some idea of Dylan to get us to think differently of Jagger. I never heard "I Can't Get No Satisfaction" in quite the same way after that dinner. Behind the legendary riff, in those words and the way those words are delivered, is a vision of identity in the post-war commercial age that's as immersed and complicated as Andy Warhol's. But it's certainly not the lone example of great writing attributed to Jagger Richards. Brown Sugar, Sympathy for the Devil, Shattered, Midnight Rambler, Painted Black. Springsteen's argument involved reading the Stones against the grain. The band's unwritten manifesto might say, "It's only rock and roll, jackass, don't build a church on top of it." But Following Springsteen's example, it's our right to ignore all that. We're fans, and we get to do this. That night, Springsteen was speaking as a fan, sitting next to another one, a guy with whom he debated rock and roll for a very long time. How many hours had those two particular fans given to thinking about the Stones? And obviously, the job wasn't complete and would never be complete. They were chewing on the same bone and still getting meat off it. That, arguably, is what gives songs and recordings their greatest power. We can keep going back and getting more. The brevity of the popular song, our almost compulsive listening practices, and the very personal nature of how we take the stuff in, it all contributes to the music's self-replenishing quality. The best material seems to continually allow for new meanings. Those two fans were layering one more conversation about the Stones on top of many, many others they'd had since they were adolescents. Novels we might read twice, generally once. Movies we might see a few times. Our favorite recordings we can listen hundreds, even thousands of times. They go through our systems in a very different way. A great recording, listened to hundreds and hundreds of times over a period of years, even decades, can suddenly open onto a new vista or back alley. The medium is dense, and obviously whatever one is going through in life triggers that density in different ways. On stage in 1990, talking to his audience and setting up Nebraska's Mansion on the Hill, Springsteen described those car rides taken with his father through Freehold, New Jersey. We would drive around the town, he explained. It was funny. We'd live there, always, but yet we'd go sightseeing. Same town, new ways of seeing it. Sightseeing in the place you know best. That's what listening to great songs and recordings is like. Some would say that the special ones are just better for sightseeing, even if you think of them as your own backyard. Songs like I Can't Get No Satisfaction. You could drive past that sucker 1,000 times and still come up with new ideas about what's going on in there. Career songwriters know how people consume music because in most cases that's where it all started for them, as consumers themselves, falling in love with songs, playing them over and over. So they know that if they write a good one, someone out there will listen on repeat. For the songwriters like Springsteen, the song is created as a thing to be visited many times, so make it ready for the sightseers. After decades in the world, Nebraska is one of those recorded works recognized for its simplicity, but also for its density, its many-layeredness. It's a record you come back to, a record with more than its share of mystery, a record that keeps mattering and keeps throwing off new meanings. Maybe it's the record of Springsteen's that's the most collaborative with the listener. Unfinished. You could say he left it for us to complete. He trusted his art and trusted us to do something with it. Epilogue. Seeing the Place. Around the time this book was nearing completion, I got a call from an unknown number. It was Springsteen. Warren, he said with some satisfaction. I'm standing in the room where 40 years ago I recorded Nebraska. He hadn't been there since 1982, but laughed at all that remained the same. My first question was obvious. The wall-to-wall orange shag rug, is it still there? He confirmed that it was so, safe from any heavy-handed remodeling. If you want to see the room, he told me, the owner said it'd be okay. We just have to find a time when the renters aren't home and we can go out there together. In an earlier email, when Bruce asked if there was anything else I needed for the book, I had only asked if he could share the address of the Colts Neck rental. I wanted to look at the place from the outside before I wrapped up the project, but he was going to do me one better and give me the final stop on my pilgrimage. We would be going in. I'd envisioned the room and the house so many times. Writing books is a strange, mostly solitary affair. You work from research, archival materials, testimony. You listen to voices, you hear voices. But the writing itself is still the imaginative process of a single person looking out a window at something that isn't there. It's educated conjuring. Given this, the opportunity to finally bring a certain materiality to it all is profound. To be in that room with Springsteen, standing on the orange shag carpeting. It was only a matter of days before I made my way out to Colts Neck, first going to Springsteen's home to meet him. I'd cleaned my younger son's hockey gear out of our Volkswagen just in case Springsteen was going to drive with me. I didn't know how it was going to go down. Arriving at the property, I drove to the same spot where I'd parked for the interviews and went to the recording studio, which has all the gear needed to make commercial recordings. As with most artists of Springsteen's caliber, there's no need for him to leave home to make records of the highest quality. I was there for only a few minutes when a very clean blue 1970 El Camino pulled up. We wouldn't be taking the Volkswagen. Patty got this for me after we used it in Western Stars, Springsteen explained. Why, I wondered aloud as we headed out the driveway, does every car of that general vintage seem to have the exact same smell? We considered this. Oil and gas leaks over time, common materials, upholstery. There's a recipe they all seem to follow that gets you to that scent. If you love cars from that era, or if you simply come from that era, it's an opening onto the past, which Springsteen acknowledged was where we were going anyway. The owner of the Colts Neck rental where Nebraska was made is still the owner. He's a realtor in the area, but like many realtors, he's not just a realtor. He's got some stuff cooking on the side. That day prior to our visit, he was meeting with a team from a Philadelphia museum there to pick up some cannons from the Revolutionary War era. The cannons, it seems, have a direct tie to George Washington. It was a major score for the museum and an already interesting day in rural New Jersey for the team when a guy that looked a lot like Bruce Springsteen walked in. The collective astonishment among the cannon transport people was obvious enough. You could see them looking at each other in that, is it just me or does that guy look like Bruce Springsteen way? Just that quickly, the stories they thought they'd be telling about picking up George Washington's cannons became something else altogether. Leaving the others in the living room, I followed Springsteen down a hallway and back to the bedroom where Nebraska was recorded. The orange wall-to-wall shag carpeting was most certainly intact, if a little washed out from the passage of time. The window that looked out onto the reservoir, once covered with drapes, was larger than what had been there in 1982. The bed was turned 90 degrees from where Springsteen had his. There were various things, including a somewhat large model of a schooner stored there, but mostly, Springsteen confirmed, this looked like the place where it had happened. The bed was right there, the headboard at that side wall, Bruce explained, pointing things out. In that corner of the room, there was a round, antique table where we put the recording machine. Mike was there. I had a chair at the end of the bed with the mics in front of me. That was it. That's how we made the record. There was some quiet, the two of us taking it in. Then Springsteen handed me his phone and said, "Can you grab a picture of me in here?" So I took a photograph of Bruce Springsteen in a room that had once been full of trouble and songs. The owners of the house were kind enough to lend me the only photographs I could find anywhere of the Nebraska house as it looked in the early 1980s. Though the bedroom where the record was recorded remains much as it was, the house had been expanded after Springsteen moved out, with the second story added, more square footage on the first floor, an expanded kitchen. The photographs they handed me were of a place that was no longer really there. In 1982, it wasn't a given that Bruce Springsteen would be looking back over 4+ decades of life, a husband and father, the leader of a rock and roll band with most of its early members still performing at his side. But how he got that far is part of another, longer adventure story. This story, that of Nebraska, unfolds still, but it stopped belonging to Springsteen some time ago. Now it's in the hands of the next person who starts digging a little deeper, who wonders what this album is, the one with the black and white photo and the blood red lettering.